or celebrations, I don't know, marking the occasion anyway, the 100th anniversary of the start of the First World War. And they asked if I would prepare something for this symposium. And they were bringing people in from England and all over the place. I think they just needed Labrador represented, and I was the token. But I don't like being token anything, especially not in relation to Labrador. So I said, well, what did you have in mind? Because I didn't know anything about it. Patty was the one that I gave them your name, by the way, and I told them that they should contact you. I guess they wanted the devil they knew rather than the one they didn't. So they suggested, well, just tell us what conditions were like in Labrador when the war started. And that seemed pretty pointless to me. I mean, I was going to be up against all these military historians who were going to be talking. So I said, well, I'd think about it and I'd look into it. So I began doing some research on it. And one of the first things that struck me was that Labrador does not have a very big presence in people's minds in Newfoundland with regard to the war, or much of anything else, I realize. But it's as if we never participated from here. And I didn't think that was actually the case. When I looked at the statistics, it didn't add up. There were certain places like Twillingate and certain, very English sort of oriented Anglican communities that had huge sign-up numbers. And there were places like St. Mary's Bay where, like they could hit all the Englishmen they wanted and they didn't care. Labrador didn't strike me as being like that. And so I started looking, and first thing I found, of course, was the website that Mr. Martin did, and that's now hosted by them days. And there's a huge amount of information on there, but it's not everything. And one of the main things that it's not is it's not about the Legion of Frontiersmen. And so that's what I'm really going to talk about tonight, and about how the Legion functioned and what their aims were, and how the sites for Labrador, which, by the way, I will prove to you eventually are just as big as the most patriotic groups in Newfoundland. In 1904, as a result of his participation in the Boer War, a guy called Roger Pocock, who had been a former Royal Canadian, well, it wasn't Royal Canadian Mounted Police then, it was the Northwest Mounted Police. He had noticed, in particular in the Boer War, as did a number of other people in particular, that when British troops went out after the wars, they were frequently without guides, without local maps, without local knowledge, and they didn't consider asking any local people for any local knowledge, and they were often ambushed and massacred. And this guy decided that there was another war coming. He was right about that, and that they had to do something about it. The dominions of the British Empire were declared shortly after this guy, I think it was 1907, I'm not positive about that date. And so that was New Zealand, Australia, South Africa, Newfoundland, and Canada. And so the 5 dominions were seen as being the kind of pioneer people, the colonizing people who went out and learned to function in the bush. And that these were the people who would be able to save Britain in the time of war. So he came out of this tradition of muscular Christianity. And when I say muscular Christianity in Labrador, nobody seems to have ever heard of it. Quite well known in Ontario, particularly because of the novels of Reverend Gordon. Glengarry Man, all those ones, Glengarry, all about the Scots in the Ottawa Valley, actually. And muscular Christianity, at the same time, when I tell somebody what it is, you immediately recognize it because it's Wilfrid Grenville. And it's this sort of patriotism, temperance, healthy mind and a healthy body, cold water baths, you name it, all that kind of doing good, and at the same time being extremely fit and athletic and aggressive. And so he sort of worked with that whole idea of the muscular Christian and what he called the glory of empire and the duties and obligations of a Christian nation. Now, if it seems familiar from Grenville, it'll also seem very familiar from the Boy Scouts, because the same people who were setting out to found the Frontiersmen were the same kind of people who were backing things like the Boy Scout movement in Canada and in the US and in England. And if you look at the uniforms, Baden-Powell's uniforms, you know, with the scout hat and the shorts or breeches, the neckerchief, all this kind of stuff, that's what it was. And it was basically an adaptation of the RCMP uniform that Pocock had used in the West, and it kind of merged in with some other stuff to make everybody feel comfortable. So they had the Australian slouch hat as well as the Mountie hat. They had bandoleros, they had knee-high boots, they wore riding pants, and they were kind of wild looking, you know, like they were adventuresome men, and this was what they wanted to project. And Grenfell absolutely would agree about the uniforms, because when he went over to France during the war, the first thing he said was that the uniforms were absolutely appalling. They sucked up mud and slime and water. They were hideously uncomfortable. He said that nobody in Labrador would ever have worn anything so foolish as the kind of uniforms that they wore in the British Army. So Pocock founded this group in 1904. One of the people who had fought in the Boer War was Arthur Wakefield. Wakefield was a doctor in Labrador. He'd been here for about 9 years when the war began, with his wife. And if you read things like Gerhard Bassler's book about Vikings to U-boats and things like that, Mrs. Wakefield shows up sending anonymous letters, or not quite anonymous, but more or less, of complaint about the Moravians because they were Germans and this kind of thing. And she was very active and involved in everything that he was doing. He started setting up these groups called the Legion of Frontiersmen as registered active battalions. They called them levies, depending on how big it was. And so we had here in Labrador, we had a battalion. We didn't ever have a full battalion. The whole group, St. Anthony and all of Labrador, was considered the basis of I think 2 or 3 levies. Then there were units and sub-units. So these are the communities in which I've actually found proof that the Legion existed. Now, the Legion's archives were all smashed to smithereens and burned in the Second World War blitz on London, because that's where the headquarters was. So there's little bits and scraps will turn up in things like the Fishes Deep, or newspapers, or, you know, with Moravian periodical accounts, or letters or mentions from Grenfell, who totally supported this whole thing, and of course Dr. Padden here in Northwest River. So there was units organized at Battle Harbor, at St. Anthony, at Bonavista Bay, apparently, although I have found just the one reference to there. Mud Lake, Northwest River, that one's a little iffy, only because there's Grand River and there's Mud Lake, and the assumption has frequently been made that the Grand River unit was actually the Mud Lake unit. But I talked it over with Susan Felsberg, who knows a great deal about Arthur Wakefield, she said that no, that she thought that the Grand River unit was the people from Northwest River, the trappers who went up the Grand River. And so they were the Highlanders. And then there was Rigolette, Red Bay, and Nain. There was an attempt to found a group in Fort Howe, didn't work, but Fort Howe used to invite the Red Bay people to come and to participate in, you know, Empire Day celebrations and things like that. One of the things you have to understand about this group, the Frontiersmen, oftentimes they call them the League of Frontiersmen, so if you're tapping them into a computer, you've got to try both, is that they were actually a private army. I mean, that's what it amounted to. They put posters up on there saying they were self-governed, made their own way, and all this kind of stuff. They bought their own uniforms. But at the same time, they were applying, after the war had begun, to the Newfoundland government to give them, for instance, customs taxes off on things like equipment and uniforms and guns and ammunition and so on. And a lot of people didn't trust them. And good reason why, because these guys were all kind of rogues. They were pirates of sorts. They were the kind of people who didn't take orders very easily. They were always fighting with each other too. In place with this, it's like they were tearing each other apart all the time. very hard to hold all this group of sort of rabid individuals together. But the closer the war got, of course, the better they got at it. The training that they were doing here in Labrador, and this was from 1911 on, so it was 3 years before the war started. There were paramilitary groups in Newfoundland. There was the Church Lads Brigade, there was the Catholic Church groups, there was the Methodist, the Highlanders. So there was 4 or 5 different paramilitary groups, but they were all connected to a specific church and religion, whereas the Frontiersmen weren't. They were Christian in their kind of push, but and a lot of them were quite rabidly Christian, like Wakefield. But at the same time, you didn't have to be, and you could be any religion and be accepted. So they got together and they started doing training and calling for members to come in and train with them to learn how to be disciplined in order when the inevitable war came. So they did elementary drill, they did marksmanship, boxing, first aid, they had lectures on various topics like hygiene and stuff like that, and also presumably war games. They also had concerts, and according to Dr. Padden, they had ward services, which I gather is just a religious service on a Sunday. And they were held here in Northwest River and in the lake. Now the qualification for membership is a bit complicated, and I'll get more into that in a few moments. But one of the important things was that there were 3 qualifications to be a member. You had to have fought in a war or an armed conflict. You had to have done service at sea, or you had to have, and this is a quote, knocked about in the wilds. And that was all. Basically, every man, woman, and child in Labrador qualified. Now, there was no age restriction, which is again another important difference between them and the church lads and the rest of them, because the church lads, once you were 18, you were out. And so it was really training boys, it wasn't training men. And also, when the actual formal armies were being organized, men over a certain age were not accepted. And the Legion said that's ridiculous because the old people are the ones who really know everything. And they have the skills already. So they opened it up to anybody that wanted to get in. And that's why I think there were probably a lot of boy soldiers who ended up coming from, I mean, relatively speaking, given the numbers, from Labrador. Because, if you're 14 years old and everybody's out there marching around and swinging guns around, dressing up and having fun, and you can only think that there was only so much entertainment going on around here, and this was classic entertainment. It had all of the lectures and the music and all the rest of it. So I'm sure there were very young people in it, but there were also people who were actually too old to enlist in the war when the war finally did start. So there were people in the Frontiersmen who never did serve, but who were kind of backup for the ones who did. I have here somewhere a list of people I've managed to confirm were actually in the Legion, and I'll read the names because you may recognize some of them. Arthur Wakefield from Battle Harbour, F.E. Heath from Rigolette, Hudson's Bay Company, J. Ford of Nain, T. Evans of Hopedale, Harry Padden of Grand River, and eventually Northwest River, H.P. Williams of Red Bay, H.G. Webb, who was the 8,000th man to sign on to the Legion. And that's why he was written up, and they had a little newspaper that they used to send out. John Shywack of Rigolette, W. Y. Pike of Red Bay, John Fenelon of Red Bay, Lorenzo Learmonth of Rigolette Hudson's Bay Company, although he was also stationed in Mud Lake and in Cartwright. He was moved around a good bit. He was only a young fella then. Dan Groves, Charlie Mesher, and these were identified by Pat, Frank Blackhall, and that name gets a bit mangled up sometimes, so I thought there were actually 2 people, but I realized it's just one guy. Peter Smith from the Hudson's Bay Company, Fred Gowdy, who the little item that I found that identified him as a frontiersman was in that. We went to Churchill Falls last summer, and in the bottle they have a list of all the people who went to the falls early on, and he signed himself as a frontiersman and said that he was serving as a frontiersman. Robert Michelin and John Blake from here. Also, Dr. Seymour Armstrong of Battle Harbor, Martin Spencer at St. Anthony, and I don't know if he was a Labradorian or not, but a lot of frontiersmen were Labradorians who had been brought up in the orphanage in St. Anthony after they'd been brought over there. Dr. H. Mather Hare, who served in St. Anthony and Mud Lake, and Dr. John Grieve, who doesn't seem to be a Labradorian Grieve, but has the same name and so on. So there was also kind of a ladies' auxiliary, I guess you'd call it, with various people's wives and daughters and stuff, who did things like help them with the uniforms and helped raise money for them and things like that. The skills that they were looking for in people were all the skills that Labradorians had, most of them already obtained. They could track, they could hunt, they could shoot, they knew how to survive in very uncomfortable, miserable conditions. And so they were seen as being the kind of people who would be really, really helpful, because modern warfare was changing things. You know, this idea of the kind of war that they had in Vietnam, for instance, where you're not just getting two armies coming together, it's people sneaking through the jungle and jumping on each other and ambushing each other. And that was becoming much more like that. Then, as the technology was changing, you just weren't going to march a whole line of men. When you did that, you ended up with Beaumont Hamel, and all your guys are dead. So they wanted people who knew how to sneak around at night and how to get behind enemy lines and figure out where they were. And that's why they were so keen on getting the Labradorians involved. Now, not everybody who signed on, as I said, was able to, signed on as a frontiersman, was able to sign on to the regular army. So that John Groves, for instance, his brother Daniel was killed. He had a family of 5 or 6 kids, and there was no way he could leave them with no support. He took over his brother's trap line, which was just up there by the Goose River, and he ran the trap line to help support Daniel and the family, as well as his own work. And so he was basically out of it. He was not going to. He was still training and working and recruiting and supporting from back here. Patton himself tried to sign on. He went over to England as soon as he realized that the war was, about to happen, and offered to sign on. And the frontiersman, the head guy in London, said, "Don't do it. You're too valuable in Labrador. We need you there." And so he was basically he retrained in some medical procedures that he thought would be very useful, and went back to Labrador. Fred Gowdy is another one that Patty's had a good look for him, and she can't find him in the records. I'm not sure he isn't in there, because there have been others that I was looking for this evening from the Mi'kmaq people down in Newfoundland who are listed as having fought in the war, and they're not on and in the regiment, but they're not on the regiment's list. I don't know how that could happen or why it would happen, but maybe names have been changed or something like that. I don't know. So there was all these guys getting ready for the war, and yet, as Patty can tell you, one of them actually ended up in the first 500, and that his picture is over there. That was who was it?
Joe.
Yes.
Joe.
Right. Sorry, Joe. Yeah.
And he was in the first 100, but he was
Early
in
on.
that first fall.
Yeah, and he was down in St. John's anyway, and so he was able to get in. And the reasons why there are so few Labradorians, or one Labradorian really, who shows up in that first wave of recruitment, are really complicated, and they have to do with Joe Michelin of Sabasquatcho. Yeah, here it is. My notes were better than I thought. I should have relied on them. Okay, oh, here's a picture I wanted to show you. This is Arthur Wakefield standing on an iceberg outside Battle Harbor, having his daily plunge. And he did this at Salisbury Plains when everybody else was suffering from frostbite. He was stand naked in the camp and dumped himself with icy water and stuff. He was quite a guy. He went afterwards on the Everest expedition. That was a failure, and he was blamed for a lot of it because he was older by then, and they said that he was too old to. He was the medical man on that failed Everest attempt. Now, what I have here is a very fuzzy, bad shot, and I haven't been able to find the original. This is out of the Newfoundland Encyclopedia, and it's labeled the League of Frontiersmen, but it should be the Legion of Frontiersmen. And these guys, you can't tell where it is. It might be Mud Lake, it could be anywhere. And it's labeled as the last of the frontiersmen, the last of the Labrador frontiersmen. So it's possible it was taken after the war rather than before or even during the war, because the Legion sort of fizzled out after the First World War. By then, people were going to have real armies or none. Maybe somebody's mother would be able to recognize them from this picture, but I couldn't identify anybody. A lot of the faces are just washed out because of the snow, but they're all wearing white Labrador dickies. They're all wearing skin boots, and they're all carrying either rifles or sticks. Hard to tell. You can't tell what they are, but they clearly have designed their own uniform because the uniforms were all different everywhere you went. There were no uniforms available when the war first started, so when you look at the old footage of the Newfoundland Regiment going over, you'll see some of them wearing, quid hats and slouch hats and cloth caps and Elsinore hats and all sorts of weird things, and it's because they hadn't been issued with any hats yet. The White Clothing Company, which Richard White, that's Winston's father's and Winston's grandfather, Captain Richard White, they owned the White Clothing Company, and they did very well out of the war. I'm not knocking them, believe me, but that's the fact of life. The war is sometimes extremely, extremely lucrative. This is another picture which I'll lay over here, and you may actually be able to see more of it. I have it digitally. If anybody wants it, I can probably send it to them. And you can see these guys. There's there's about 15 of them. They're wearing skin boots. It's obviously spring because they have no mitts or gloves or anything on. And this is the only known pre-war photograph that I've been able to find of the Legion frontiersmen in Labrador. Now, Arthur Wakefield's grandson might have some, I don't know. This one came from Yellowknife, and I was put onto it by the historian of the Legion frontiersmen. They had it listed, they couldn't find a copy of it, and he managed to track down that it came from Yellowknife, so I contacted them in Yellowknife, and they were able to get it for me. Lorenzo Learmonth was a Hudson's Bay Company clerk. He was about 19 years old at that time, and he went on to become a famous historian, archaeologist, who found the remains of the Franklin expedition that has caused so much interest in the last few months. He worked with the Hudson's Bay Company right through, but when I was working in Coppermine, I kept coming across the ghost of Lorenzo Learmonth because he'd had a photo developing darkroom in Coppermine, and had taken many, many hundreds of thousands probably photographs, and had trained a number of Inuit to take photographs as well. And I've actually met a lot of people who knew him because for some reason, older people, like people in their 70s and 80s, were coming back to Coppermine. I think it's because it was on an Air Canada run and you could get there on points. And the summer that I was spending there, a number of them turned up and told me lots and lots of stories about Lorenzo Learmonth, and he was really quite a guy. And he had a huge impact in the long run. But at this time, this is probably the first camera he ever had, maybe the first photograph he ever took, for all I know. I don't know what else is over there in Yellowknife from Labrador, from Lorenzo. But whatever it is, it's going to be worth paying attention to, and somebody should go and have a look at it. There was the isolation issue. I think that's over days. I'm astonished about most of the time because there was some Marconi State Battle Harbor. That one. There were missionaries over the place. There were postmen. There were traders. There were hunters. These people used to come constantly. A lot of people had 2 and traffic houses, and they got around. There were no hotels. It was, you know, you didn't want to set up a camp. It takes a long time to set up a camp, and to break it down again in the morning and to carry all that stuff. So they stayed with other people. I think that there may have been groups and small family units who didn't know about the war, who didn't get any information, but I think that there was probably a lot more being passed around by mouth than we're aware of. But yes, the isolation and the lack of communication certainly was an issue. Second thing is that the war started in 1914 in August. A couple of days before the war actually started, there was a call went out for the Naval Reserve, and over 400 men were pulled from the Labrador fishery to go and check in with the Naval Reserve. And many, many more went in the months after that. And when the people just suddenly disappear from their jobs, someone has to fill in. So the people who were living here and who were staying here were the ones who were called upon to come and tie up the fishery and finish it up for that particular year. That was the refusal of the governor's permission. And that is a really, well, I'll get back to that one in a minute, I think, because there's other things. Height and weight requirements, okay? You had to be 5'3", and you had to weigh at least, I think it was 130 pounds or something like that. And our ancestors weren't quite as plump as us. And they weren't as tall as most of us either. And a lot of the Labrador people couldn't meet the requirement for it. They were, you know, thin as gads. And so eventually, as the war progressed, they dropped the requirement, and you could get in if you were 5 feet tall. If you were fit, and you were 5 feet tall and weighed 112 pounds, I think it was, you were in. By then they were for cannon fodder, I think. But certainly TB and lack of nutrition and things like that had an impact. I don't know if the statistical failure of the medicals is any greater than it was in Newfoundland. Somehow I don't think it would have been. That's the impression I have from what I've read. Newfoundland had a very high rate of refusal. The medical people just wouldn't pass these guys because they just weren't well. The Aboriginals are in all of the British Dominion at that time were exempt from conscription. So even if conscription had come in earlier in the war, they wouldn't have had to go. So there was no assumption that they would ever serve. Also, there was an initial economic hardship involved with the war. Eventually, as the war went on, it bounced back and actually got better, and people did better economically than they had when the war, just before the war started. But at the beginning of the war, fish dropped from $7.50 per quintal to $4, and the fur market disappeared. So that there was, for a year or two until things kind of got going again and the war started to boost the economy, there was actually serious problems with people getting enough money or enough credit to be able to make it through the winter. Now, I need to talk a bit about this is the refusal of the governor's permission. Let me just find my papers here. Okay, Statutes of Newfoundland, 1909 to 1912, under George H. Emerson's involvement in putting them together, and this was the statutes being collapsed down into one unit, made consistent. They have an act respecting the Eskimos and Indians resident in Labrador, passed March 29th, my birthday, 1911. So it was just at the same time that Wakefield was founding the Legion Frontiersmen. Be it enacted by the Governor, the Legislative Council, and the House of Assembly in legislative session convened as follows. Without the permission of the Governor and Council first obtained, it shall be unlawful for any person to enter into any agreement with an Eskimo, Naskapi, or Mountaineer Indian to leave this colony or its dependencies for the purposes of performing any service in any place outside this colony or its dependencies, or to pay or promise to pay any money, or give or promise to give any article to any Eskimo, Naskapi, or Mountaineer Indian as a reward or inducement for leaving this colony, or to transport or furnish the means of transporting any Eskimo, Naskapi, or Mountaineer Indian from the colony to any place outside this colony, provided that nothing in this section shall prevent the employment of Eskimos, Naskapis, or Mountaineer Indians by any purpose for the purposes of fishing, hunting, or exploring upon any part of the coast or territories of the Canadian Labrador. So you could hire a fishing guide, you could hire a hunting guide, you could hire somebody to come and carry your bag for you. If you were staying within the Ungavit area, the Quebec Labrador, so presumably down to the Blancs of Law and stuff like that, but that you could not hire any Inuit or Inuit to go out of Labrador with a fine of not exceeding $500 or imprisonment not exceeding 6 months. So that was fairly significant. Now, they say in this act, Eskimo shall mean native residents of the coastal Labrador who are commonly known as Eskimos. So there you have it. There's this law that had been enacted that said that you couldn't recruit people without the governor's permission. You couldn't bring them down to St. John's to sign on. And that was reconfirmed in 1919. And to the best of my knowledge, it's never been rescinded.
Still on the books. Still on the books.
I think so. We looked. I had the clerk of the legislature look. John looked. John Griffin, one of the archivists down in St. John's, looked. Under the continuation of laws in the terms of union of Newfoundland with Canada, it states specifically that any act that was in the Newfoundland legislation could be repealed by the Parliament of Canada under paragraph 1 of this term. Could be, not is. I don't think it ever has been. I generally compare it to the Mummers Law in St. John's that outlawed mummering, and it was not repealed until the 1970s. And mostly because people just forgot about it, but it was still there. And if anybody knows what happened about this law, I'd love to hear about it. But like I said, I've looked, can't find it. So, it could be that we're all breaking the law all the time now. I think it would be incredibly interesting and funny if it really is there and if I can prove it. Now that law was instituted by Governor McGregor, and for a good purpose. He had previously been the governor of New Zealand, and hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of Maoris were taken out of New Zealand to go and be exhibited in things like zoos and circuses and stuff like that, and they almost all died. Same thing happened here in Labrador with the ones who went to the Chicago World's Fair. It took McGregor from 1907 until 1911 to get that law passed to protect people. And at the time that he was doing this, there were entrepreneurs up here actively recruiting, actively trying to get people to go down and to take part in these chautauquas and things like that. Now, people did it afterwards, and Lizzie Ford did it, and lots of other Inuit from Labrador in the 1930s went and took part in these performances and stuff, and the famous Columbia, of course. But at that time, it was almost as good as a death sentence to take them to these places. And it was, those of you that have followed what happened to Abraham Mulroy and his family will understand why McGregor was determined to do this. Now, he had Grenfell backing him up on it. John Griffin told me that he thought it was all Grenfell's idea, but it wasn't, because McGregor had, as I said, he had previously done this in New Zealand. And he said it had stopped a real abuse of people. So you have this law. You'd think that the governor's permission would be automatic to go and fight for the empire, but it wasn't. It wasn't automatic at all. Dr. Padden wrote to him and said, I can send you 150 men tomorrow. And not McGregor, but the current governor, wrote back and said, please don't. He said, I don't know what the situation is there. And his words were, I don't wish to denude the Labrador coast of the men who make the economy go and who are there to support their families. And he said, until I'm sure that there is some kind of support for the people, the men or the women and kids left behind, he said, I don't want these men to come down yet. Now, that changed in 1917. They started an active recruitment in Labrador in 1917 because the ranks of the Newfoundland Regiment had been so horrendously decimated. They were scraping the bottom of the barrel. They were going to take anybody at that point. And that's when they were sending people up. And Padden had some pretty harsh words to say for the recruiters who came up looking for these guys. He felt that the frontiersmen had, they'd already had medicals, they'd already been trained to some extent. They were realistic about what was going to happen, particularly by 1917. They were realistic because they knew by then how devastating the war was. So you've got all these different things kind of playing off to reduce the numbers of the Labrador people who were serving. By 1917, and there's a book called, I have the title on there, just see if I can find it here, by a guy called Weingard. And Weingard has written a book about Indigenous recruitment and service in Canada. So he's not just looking at Newfoundland, he's looking at all of Canada, and also at other areas of the British Empire. So according to Timothy C. Weingard, France was the only imperialist European state to regard its colonial indigenous people as a source of recruitment when World War I broke out. It was late in 1915, before mounting casualties and an increasing demand for manpower led Britain to request that the indigenous population of the 5 Dominions be actively recruited. So Newfoundland initiated a second recruitment campaign in Labrador and the outports in 1917. And that's when they started to go in greater numbers from here. Now, in the meantime, they had not gone, lots of them had gone, lots relatively speaking, compared to the rest of Newfoundland. Let's see if I find my notes here. The statistics were that Labrador, by 1917, Labrador had enrolled 2.58% of male population, as opposed to 3.95% of the population of Newfoundland as a whole. So it was a significant drop. But a lot of men who had gone weren't counted as Labradorians, but they lived in Labrador, they worked in Labrador, they had families in Labrador, and they just went. And some of the people who went were, for instance, the doctors. They lost a whole bunch of doctors from here. Grenfell went over himself. He was 50 years old, and he served 3 months at a field hospital in France, with the Harvard unit, the Harvard Medical School, I guess, sent over a unit. And I think that was before the Americans actually got into it. And they lost Dr. Hare, they lost nurses, Eleanor Storr went, they lost Jessie Luther, they lost, and of course all their volunteers, and all of their money, because all of the donations to Grenfell Mission dried up and they started having to close hospitals and stuff. So it had a big impact that way. They also lost a lot of the Hudson's Bay Company clerks. And these were guys who knew the country. They were working men mostly, so they didn't stick around to wait for the governor's permission or anything else. They just went back home and signed on over there. If you look at Patty's listing over here, you'll see she's got them down as kind of associated to Labrador. So we had Hare, Grenfell, Wakefield, didn't lose Harry Cadden, but there were two other doctors as well that ended up going off. The Hudson's Bay guys, there was Blackall, Heath, Smith, Vermont, and I think there were several others as well. And so these were guys who were important to the economy of the country. And the women, nobody has ever mentioned women. The women who went over and worked with the army nurses and occupational therapists, worked with the American Army. Now, she was having a big fight with Mrs. Grenfell at the time, so it was a good excuse to get out. But what did she choose to do? She chose to go and do military service. So there was a lot of that kind of thing. So also, of course, the people who were coming up who were the kind of nomadic transhumans people who were coming back and forth from Newfoundland, all these guys involved in the Labrador fishery had just disappeared. It just had a huge impact. I think that if we were to add in all those people, I think the numbers coming out of Labrador would have been much higher than that out of Newfoundland even. There's people who weren't counted. There was a fellow over here, you see a young guy, Edward Seward. I met his nephew at the symposium, and I said, how come we never heard of this guy? We know that he was from Red Bay, and he doesn't show up anywhere in the records. And he said it was because he was underage when he went in. He was one of the boy soldiers. He was 16 years old, and his parents had moved across to Rocky Harbour. And so he was listed as being from Rocky Harbour and being 18. But he was from a family that had been in Labrador for generations. I think there's probably others like that. Like Daniel Rose and John Rose had a brother who signed on up in Canada and who settled in Manitoba afterwards. So he doesn't show up, but as far as I'm concerned, he's a Labradorian. Okay, why did they want people from Labrador in particular? Well, part of it was the skills that they had. And there's this other thing that has only really been talked about much by Weingard. And I taught in Ontario for quite a long while. And I taught Aboriginal studies, and I have a daughter who's adopted, who's Aboriginal. She's an Iroquois. She's from the Oneida of the Thames group, and her grandfather fought in the war, and the Second World War, I think. But I think she had great-grandparents in the First World War also. The recruitment that went on in Southern Ontario was ferocious. They were hiring these guys as snipers mostly. And the reason was that they were seen to have skills that white people didn't have. And one thing was eyesight. Okay, they're supposed to be very sharp-eyed and able to see in the dark. And so if you wanted your guy or your sniper, you wanted, if you could, to get yourself a good Indian. And they weren't allowed off the reserve if they even go in court unless they were actually enlisted in the army or something. The army gave them huge freedoms that they'd never had before. So there was a lot of them went into the army in the First and Second World War. But mostly the whole idea was that these were warrior nations, okay? The Iroquois were one of the few Aboriginal groups that had standing armies. I mean, they had soldiers already, they had their own soldiers. And so for these guys to go into the army, it was natural. They had the discipline, they had the skills, they had the interest, they had the heritage, and they were wanted. They were really wanted. And it was probably the first time in their lives that anybody wanted them. So even when I was living there in the 1970s, 1980s, London, Ontario has an army base, and I met lots and lots and lots of Aboriginal soldiers. And you may remember, some of you, in the 1970s, there was a push here in Labrador for Aboriginal recruitment, and I met a number of girls in Ottawa from Maine and Northwest River who joined up in the army. So there was this, I won't call it a myth because it wasn't a myth, I think it was to some extent true, that Aboriginal people made better soldiers than most. And the reason was because they were primitive savages, of course, and had what was called the bloodlust, so that they liked it, they liked to kill them, and they were good at it. And so that they wanted to get as many of them as they could. Now, I can find my notes here on frost. I just came across something yesterday that I thought would really illustrate what I was talking about how useful these guys had made themselves. And if I can't find it, I'm going to have to just tell you what it said. No, it's in another file. Okay, some of you will have heard on the radio the diaries of Sidney Frost have just been published as memoirs of the Blue Platy. And in it, he talks about, and I think it's also, he wrote big chunks of it fighting Newfoundlander. It went in under Nicholson's name. Nicholson acknowledged him, but Frost didn't want it under his name, and that's why it wasn't. But he wrote a private memoir for his children and his grandchildren, and he asked that it not be published. But they decided that, you know, the war was 100 years ago. This is a beautiful event. It's a beautiful book. The man was just, he was a lovely man. He was from Nova Scotia originally, went to Newfoundland when he was 18, and the war broke out within a couple of months. He signed on to the Newfoundland Regiment, and he served right through to 1919 and went into Germany at the end of the war. And got wounded any number of times. And at one point, they took 3 bullets out of the leg and didn't notice that he had 3 more in the other leg. And he was walking around on that for 2 months before somebody figured out why he was feeling so lousy. But he gave a description of how important the guides were. That when you went into the battlefield, everything was, you know, blown to smithereens. That what you knew one day might be known as, you know, St. John's Road or something like that. The next day was just a mud hole. And most of the time, they were trying to move around in the dark. So they needed guides, and they had a system set up whereby they would be assigned to a particular part of the battlefield. They would go there, the guide would meet them there, and would show them the way. And sometimes the guides got lost. Anyway, they got lost, his battalion, and late in the war, when things were very bad and they had no food, they were quite hungry and cold and sick and everything else. And he said he didn't think he could take one more step. And they bumped into another guide in the dark. And he said, I'll see if I can figure out where we are. And he went off and he came back and he said, I found the trail, I found the path, follow me. And he took them out of this terrible bog that they were in and brought them right back to where they were supposed to be, where there was food and all the rest of it. And he said, and of course he could do this because before the war he was a trapper and he worked up north. And so that's it. And of course we all know about John Shywack. Well, there were 10 Mi'kmaq from Newfoundland who were recruited, all of whom were snipers. And that's the jobs that most of these guys did, sniping and guiding. And they were good at it, and they did it well. So that kind of explains why you get the bump in recruitment as the war goes on. The more that they saw of the war, the more they realized what skills were actually valuable to them. And I think that's about all I need to say, except that Richard White, okay, there's just a little bit about him because I just finished doing an article about him, and I'm still finding out a lot. He's a fascinating man. This, of course, is Winston's father, and he was a lawyer who trained at the London School of Economics, came back to St. John's to practice law with his family, or near his family. And those of you that know St. John's, if you look right across the harbor to the south side, there's 4 great big houses, 2 big duplexes that are beautifully painted up and real handsome old houses. Those were the 4 houses that old Captain White built for his 4 daughters. Because he wanted them right under, he was a good Methodist, wanted them under his, Richard was probably lucky to get away to Labrador. He came to Labrador because he had tuberculosis. And he was told that if he stayed outdoors, he might live. And so he went to Northwest Territories prospecting for gold first. And then he ended up, as a part of a survey, doing some kind of, I don't know whether it was a mineral survey or a mapping survey or what, but he was sent with this survey group into northern Labrador. That was taken the day that the picture that's over there of Richard White with his father was taken the day that he got back. And he didn't sign on, but he was said by Joe Smallwood, according to Winston, to have recruited something like 15 people from around the Nain area. I haven't found any Innu at all who've served. It doesn't mean they didn't do it. It means I haven't been able to find them, and maybe they were under other names and things like that, but somehow I doubt it. But then I didn't know there were Mi'kmaq either, so who knows? And there, as I said, there are people listed in Weingard's book as, you know, the last indigenous man recruited from Newfoundland, from the islands specifically. And I can't find him in the lists anywhere, but I think that he's there. There is a panel number given, so you can go to the rooms and look it up and find him. He could be an Inuk, of course. He's just living in Trinity area or something like that, because there were lots down there moving around. So Richard White, he was actively recruited in 1918, late in the war, to go into Siberia as a dog handler. He was 40 years old. He had tuberculosis. He was not a well man particularly. He wasn't unhealthy, but you know, I doubt that he was as robust as he might have been if he hadn't been so sick for so long. His wife died of tuberculosis, and I think 6 of his children or something died very early, and possibly of TB. So he went off to Siberia, Vladivostok, and one of his relatives has just given his son a Russian icon that he brought back with him. Now, why did Richard White go? Well, let's look at the names of his children. Douglas Haig White, after Field Marshal Douglas Haig. Roger Key White, after the Admiral of the Fleet at the Dardanelles. Reginald Tyrwhitt White, Admiral of the Fleet also. And Winston Churchill White. So, you can't tell me that wasn't patriotic. And I think that was the kind of thing that we don't understand anymore. That patriotism that says we have to protect the mother country. Even when the mother country has told us that we're not good enough, when the mother country has turned us into slaves or servants or welfare bums, that there's this patriotism that existed 100 years ago that just made people who'd never seen England call England home. And I think that's all I have to say. Thank you. I will answer questions if I can, or Patty might be able to.
The list that you read off at the beginning, just for my clarification, was that a list of frontiersmen or a list of people that actually served in the war?
I don't know which list you need.
It's frontiersmen. I took
Frontiersmen.
You had a list that they were on a sheet of loose
Yeah.
leaf and you list off.
Yeah.
That was
Yeah, because John
frontiers.
Ross would
You read a whole list of names. I got them all. Frontiersmen.
So out of that list, not everybody was eligible to
No.
serve.
Some of them would have failed medical. Some of them wouldn't have been able to look after their families. You know, if they had families, if they had kids.
Can you tell me if you have a hard number of Labradorians that you could confirm actually served on the battlefield in the war?
Patty's got a list right there.
Oh, right over there, perfect.
Yeah. But I think there are others. That we-
And there could be more, but there's not very many more. And if there are more, it hasn't been passed through anecdotal evidence, nor have we been able to find any written documentation. So, you know, you may have slipped 1 or 2, but you haven't slipped any great number.
But there was probably, if you include the HPC and the doctors and the nurses,
Yeah.
probably 100 people. And 100, given the population here at that time, 100 of the best, the healthiest, the best educated, most capable. That was a big, big loss.
Well, some came back.
They came back damaged too, some physically and emotionally and mentally. You know, John Curl was a wreck for the rest of his life. He'd been gassed, he went blind, and he suffered horrendous shell shock. He was completely useless. His 12-year-old son had to look after the family. You know, and there were a lot of stories like that. And, you know, I look back on it now, okay, I'm 65 years old, and I remember the old man from Beaumont Hamel. I remember, you know, like a very dear and sweet man who was a friend of my father's who lost his leg at Beaumont Hamel. His father had been a doctor. He had a little candy shop down near the wharf. You know, he drank too much. He was a nice man. He was loved by his family, but he never reached his potential ever. He never got over it. There was another old bloke who lived down by us who his job was had a little battery shop behind his house, and you could go and get your battery charged up there for your car or whatever you had. And on July 1st, he would get roaring drunk, and tear up and down the street, crying and screaming and yelling, and all of us kids would be hauled in off the street, and the lines would all be pulled, and everybody would pretend it wasn't happening because they didn't want to humiliate him by looking. And I remember all the vets down by the War Memorial, sitting there with their bottles inside brown paper bags. And, you know, they were sad, sad people.
Well, I remember one guy, he came from Ireland and he stowed away and he came to Newfoundland and he settled in here and he volunteered in the war. And he was wounded and he came back and then he fathered 22 youngsters. And he had a pretty happy life, or he seemed to.
Yeah. Of the ones that I've been sort of tracking what happened to them in later life, Wakefield was a wreck. He was in the battle station. He had, at Salisbury Plain, for some reason, we've never understood why. He went over as the assistant medical officer on the Florizel. He was with the Newfoundland Regiment at Salisbury Plain. And one day he simply up and requested a transfer. Something had obviously happened. His biographer doesn't know what it was, but he was transferred to another battalion. But quite by coincidence, he ended up in a field dressing station when the Newfoundland Regiment came through at the end of Beaumont Hamel. And he was never the same, never. He served out the entire war, either in various troops. He joined up with the Canadian Expeditionary Forces. He did some work on the ships that were going back and forth with the men. He lost his faith, which was everything to him. His family said he never ever smiled again. He was suffered severely from depression. He just couldn't function anymore. Lorenzo Learmont is the only one, as far as I know, who had a happy ending of all the ones that I tried to follow up on. And he had a girlfriend up north, but he didn't marry, but he did have a daughter who he was very fond of. His girlfriend, I think of her as his country wife. She died of TB up in Coppermine. But he had a very fulfilling career with the Hudson's Bay Company, who basically let him do what he wanted. He was one of the founders of Fort Ross and some of those other stations. So Ernie Lyle, for instance, the Arctic Man, you know, he and Ernie worked together for many years. And basically his position with the Hudson's Bay Company made him a kind of roving archaeologist and historian. And that's how he spent the rest of his life. And finding the Franklin remains was, of course, huge for him, a wonderful coup. But I think he was essentially a happy man. But I don't know how he did it. Other people couldn't.
Some of the Labrador people
Yes,
live
Yeah.
good, full family lives. I can think of 3 or 4 or 5. Well, some of them didn't serve very long, but I'm thinking of the ones who went in, say, in 1915, and so actually did like 2, 3 years of
Yeah.
battle. And some of those came back and married and lived good family lives.
Yeah. And Sidney Frost did as well.
Yes, and thinking of people like Murdoch and Taylor and his dad, right? I mean, he came back and married and had a great time. And you know, they had their ways. I've heard many stories of when they would actually meet each other. It's almost like they would withdraw from the other people and just, they never talked war to their children or their family or anybody, but to each other they did.
Yeah, Aidan Hogan, when I told my father, when I was growing up and Aidan had died, and I said something to Dad about how, when we were kids, every time you asked him about his missing leg, he had a different story. He said, what do you mean? I said, well, I still remember he told me that he'd been playing a baseball game against Mickey Mantle. Mickey hit that ball so hard, he his leg right off. Of course, you know, I'm 6 years old, I believe him. But the story was always changing. Dad was astonished that he could make these jokes with us kids about it, that he didn't tell us that he lost it in the war, because he was obsessive about talking about it elsewhere. You know, he couldn't get past it.
My mom said she was a teenager when World War II came on. And of course, by then they had radios and stuff in Sandwich Bay. And so that every day the war news was written on the edge of the blackboard. The teacher wrote it on. And they were all caught up with the excitement of World War II. So of course, the fact that their dad had been in World War I, you know, come on, Dad, fill us in, give us the details. And he never ever told them one fact about himself, just lighthearted stuff like calling back and forth to the Germans in the trenches, or stories of a couple of the other soldiers, but never anything like, he never ever told them that he killed anybody. He never told them, like, nothing. Everything they ever learned about him was long after he was dead. Other veterans would share the stories, but he wouldn't, you know, they were teenagers, like, all excited with this war news, and, you know, maybe Dad can give us the dirt, like, you know, but Dad wouldn't or couldn't, or...
Patty, is there anything you want to add? She's the expert, not me.
No, just, you always stretch me. This is a facet of the world war. I started researching many years ago, but because of my grandfather and the respect that my mother and, you know, his wife had for him. And so you sort of grow up, and I always knew there was a giant vacuum for Labrador information about their veterans and about their World War experience. So I haven't done anything with it, so I'm just ever so glad that you're even picking up my bouncing little ball over there off the floor and carrying it for a way. You know, that's great, because anything and everything is knowledge for our people. That's more
the Legion of Frontiersmen is something that nobody knows about, and it was almost a completely Labrador story. They did later establish a unit in St. John's that was in charge of Fort Amherst and the Narrows, and that was Rendell, Colonel Rendell did it, and at the same time, though, it wasn't a St. John's initiative. It was Wakefield who went down and said, "Look, this is what we're doing in Labrador. What are you doing?" And it was the only opportunity that people didn't have an attachment to a church or a specific religion to actually get involved. One thing that I didn't mention was that when the Legion was first founded, it was whites only. And Wakefield was one of the ones who broke that barrier. He just refused to acknowledge it. And he just said, "I'm not paying any attention." And the historians, there's a group of them called the Historians of the Legion, Frontiersmen or something like that. And there's a website. So if you Google it, you'll find it. They don't like talking about the race issue because it reflects badly on the beginning. But they do. One of them wrote to me and he said Wakefield was just, he wasn't having it.
I wasn't sure where you were going, Robin or Patty, with your presentation. I brought the maps along last 2 years ago. We were over with Jeff Goodyear and his father. Mm-hmm. And his father, Terry, lost 3 uncles.
Yes, grandfathers.
Yeah, it's quite a story. Anyway, on the map, I circled the different battles that the Newfoundland Regiment was in, and I didn't know if I missed it in your talk, but did these frontiersmen serve exclusively with the Newfoundland Regiment, or were they distributed amongst various units in?
Most of them are with the regiment.
Okay,
Labrador people mostly.
would have
A
traveled.
few people, like one guy entered the call for the Naval Reserve. He must have been a Naval Reserve. We had a few people in the Navy. I know a guy from Spotted Island, Black Tickle area, served in the Navy.
And the Canadian
a couple more.
Expeditionary Forces.
And there were Canadian Expeditionary, because some of them were working up in Ontario and stuff when the war happened, so they signed on wherever they were and stuff like that. So they were, but the bulk, if you assume there's 100, then at least 75.
Grenfell made a point of saying, we're keeping these men together, we're not breaking them up.
Yeah. But they were together. They hung together. Some of grandfather's stories were about how they were together. And I know Robert Michelin helped my husband's grandfather, who was from Sandwich Bay, so they did not know each other prior to, but there was a bond. And Robert had actually guided some Lord up to Church and Falls before the war, a year or two before the war. And he had ever said, well, you know, jokingly, like you do, well, now if you ever come to England, let me know. So of course, Robert signed up, and so 3 or 4 years later, he's in, well, actually Scotland training, but he sends a letter to this Lord and says, well, I'm here. But the real cool thing is that every 6-8 weeks, the whole time, even in France, this Lord sent a package of food to Robert Michelin. And Robert Michelin actually gave a lot of it to my husband's grandfather, because Robert used to say, I can go all day and I don't eat. I don't eat home. I don't have to eat here. Like he could just go on sheer whatever. But my husband's people, and I believe it because my husband is still like today, I hate all the cooking I have to do, but they're always hungry. And so apparently his grandfather had this illusion that he was just starving. He was hungry all the time. And Robert really felt for him, and he actually gave him a lot of his food.
There's a lot in Sidney Frost's book about hunger.
Yeah.
You know, these guys did not get
I know
enough.
they couldn't do bully beef after they came back. They just are like hungry or no hungry.
That happened.
There's no bully beef.
Yeah.
Like better to have a squirrel soup or something than
Yeah.
bully beef. So it was bad.
Thank you. Thank you for coming.
Well,